Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 1 game from the Luneberg Chess Festival. Now, if you followed the last video in the Road to Grandmaster series, you know that I actually secured my second Grandmaster norm with a draw in the last round of the ExtraCon Open, and I was extremely elated to get my second GM norm. It was a huge breakthrough moment for me, but I was actually playing chess just a few days after the ExtraCon Open ended in Germany, because I actually committed to a closed event there, closed norm event there many months previously. So I actually hopped on a plane, flew to Germany, then took multiple buses and arrived in a small German town by the name of Luneberg. And in this town, they actually have this chess festival that they run that has a closed event that I played in and then an open tournament as well. And so, yeah, it was another opportunity for me to, keep, the good vibes, the good momentum going and try and, make something of my latest results. So anyways, my opponent in the first round was a young German player by the name of Polster. He was a FIDE master around 2270, I want to say, and born in 2000. So, not even 20 years old yet. It's amazing in chess. It always seems like you're playing people younger and younger. And I'm, as I've said before, almost like the dinosaur on the tour. So, but anyways, without further ado, let me get into it. So I'm with d4, and Christian played knight f6, and then after knight f3, d6, it already kind of told me that he was angling for either a King's Indian or a Perk type of setup, and I wasn't too sure how I wanted to attack this particular setup, but I decided to start with g3, which I thought was quite flexible, because with g3, I actually am waiting to decide whether I want to go c4 or not. So, if I go c4, we're definitely going to go into King's Indian territory, but if I sit on it, I actually can wait and actually try to play for e4 without playing c4. And we'll get into the nuances of that in a little bit. So anyways, after g3, g6 was played, and then I played bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, and castles. And here's actually kind of a critical position in straight out of the opening, because you notice I actually delayed playing c4, and you might ask, why did you do that? Because typically if you just play c4, it would transpose into fianchetto King's Indian territory with knight bd7, knight c3, and e5. And this type of stuff has been played many, many times before. It's a very rich and interesting position. I've actually made the argument here that, Black's fianchetto bishop at times seems to be better than White's, because what winds up happening in this structure is, in order for White to try and prove an advantage, he typically takes space in the center with the move e4. And it's a peculiar thing that after this exchange on d4 happens, and something along the lines like rook h8, h3, and let's say knight c5, rook e1, and a5, which has been played many times. The funny thing about this position is the dark squared bishop on g7 actually is not blocked by a pawn on the long diagonal, whereas White's light squared bishop on g2 is actually blocked by an e4 pawn. So in the short term, one can argue that White's light squared bishop is actually not particularly effective, and it's really just strictly a defensive piece. But in the long term, the space becomes a serious asset, and then the bishop on g2 also matters a lot. But I think part of the reason Black can even get away with playing this way is because his bishop on g7 is kind of, has less obstruction on that diagonal. So this is something I've, thought about quite a bit, and I didn't want to get into one of those types of structures because I've tend to notice that Black does have decent counterplay there. And so I actually played an idea here that was inspired by a game I saw the young, talented GM from India, Pragananda, do, which was actually the move rook e1. And rook e1 has not been played more than maybe like 100 or so times, maybe even less than that. I haven't checked lately, but it's actually quite a rare move in this position. And the idea is, instead of going for a strict King's Indian fianchetto, he's actually trying to transpose to a fianchetto variation in a Perk. And the argument is that with the pawn on c2, in some lines he can actually blot out the bishop on g7 with the move c3 at some juncture. So I actually saw a game that Prague actually played at the Extracon Open that I was playing in before this event, where c5 was played, and then after d takes c5, Prague actually played c3. And you can see here that there's a bit of role reversal from the King's Indian fianchetto position I showed before, where this light square bishop on g2 all of a sudden is quite decent scope on the diagonal, whereas the dark square bishop on g7 is actually blunted by the pawn on c3. So that dynamic kind of ensures white a slight and nagging advantage. And in fact, Prague actually won a very, very nice game at the Extracon Open, I believe against Murali Karthikeyan, the Indian Grandmaster I played in round 5 of the Extracon Open. So anyways, after rook e1, c5 was not played. Krishnan instead went knight bd7, and I was kind of cool with this because now I'm getting in e4 kind of unopposed, and I have a nice center. And note that now I have this flexibility with my queenside setup where I can either play c3 or knight c3 depending on the circumstance. Black played e5, trying to kind of break in the center. And now I can play c3, but I decided to play knight c3. And I think now I got kind of the move order trickeration out of the way. I got a position that I'm quite pleased with because white basically transposed to a fianchetto perk variation. And I think this position just ensures white a very slight advantage based upon the space. After knight c3, c6 was played. This is typical, covering the d5 and b5 squares with the pawn, introducing ideas of putting the queen on c7, and in some lines also expansion with b5 and getting the bishop to b7. This is a typical move in that respect. And so because of that, I actually went for a4 to kind of stop b5 entirely. Now black actually went for a5. This is actually another typical move in the structure. When a4 is played, typically black tries to play a5 to limit white's space grab on the queen side. And now that a4 has been played, the adjacent square b4 can be sensitive. So there are sometimes moments where the queen can actually go to b4 via b6. And I have also seen maneuvers where the knight on d7 sometimes can actually land on b4 via c5 and a6 or b8 and a6. So yeah, those are just some move order options there. And after a5, I really want to try and finish my development, connect my rooks. But note that if I put my bishop on e3 right away, knight g4 is a little bit annoying, just harassing that bishop. So that's why I started with the move h3, because now I can play the bishop safely to e3 without allowing knight g4, which is kind of an annoying move to face because you don't want to lose the bishop pair there. So anyways, after h3, queen c7 was played. Normal move in the structure, given the c6, a5 pawn position on the queen side. And now bishop e3, continuing my development. And basically, my plan in the short term is to try and go like bishop e3, queen d2, and stuff along those lines. Note that if black goes rook e8 and takes on d4, I can actually play knight takes d4 or bishop takes d4, and either recapture actually uncovers another defender on the e4 pawn. So if I actually do wind up playing bishop takes d4, my rook on e1 covers e4, and if I go knight takes d4, my bishop on g2 covers e4. So there's nothing to fear with e takes d4 as a move. So after bishop e3, black did go rook e8, and now I actually win d5. And this was actually kind of spur of the moment decision over the board. But the basic concept, I thought, was now that the rook is actually on e8 instead of f8, the move f5 seems a long ways away, and so I wasn't very fearful of a fixed center because the rook would have to waste time going back to f8, and then the knight on f6 would have to go to e8 or h5. And I thought this dynamic would instead allow me to push forward in the center and get some initiative. The other thing is I thought this pawn tension on c6 and d5 was actually good for me, because note that if c takes d5 is actually played, I can actually go e takes d5, and again, f5 is a long ways off, and there's some sensitive squares on the queen side, particularly b5, b6, and c4. So there's maneuvers like knight b5 in the cards, harassing the queen on c7, and also the pawn on d6. There's knight d2, knight c4 ideas at times. And I think black's kingside pawn majority is not something that's going to be sort of ushered up the board in a very timely fashion. So I think white can actually get away with kind of unbalancing the position with this d5 thrust. Another point, again, is that if c5 is played, this would actually be terrible because you cede the b5 square, and now the c4 square is just, unassailable. So this knight coming to d2 and then c4 would just give white a massive, massive edge. And in fact, here, white might do well to start with knight b5, just because if now the queen on c7 wants to hold on to the d6 pawn, queen b8 seems obligatory, and then knight d2 is even stronger, coming to c4 and then ganging up on the d6 pawn. So I thought this was actually extremely unpleasant pawn tension for black, and basically Christian agreed because he didn't actually do anything about it and actually went knight c5. And this move actually attacks the e4 pawn, theoretically put some pressure on it. And I could go with knight d2, shifting the knight back over, defending the e4 pawn multiple times, and then preparing knight c4. And that's what I did, just defending that square. Also, the bishop on g2 covers that e4 pawn, and just everything is really, really well and protected here. And again, ct5, ed5, not really something I need to fear because there isn't any really great follow-up for black here in the middle. I mean, you could push e4, but you just weaken the d4 square. And again, the pawn coming to f5 seems a little ways off. So after knight d2, black actually played bishop d7, trying to connect his rooks in an artificial way. The bishop on d7 is not ideally placed, but he kind of wanted to, get the piece off the back rank. And here, I thought black's position was actually extremely awkward because now the knight on f6 can't even retreat to d7. So the knight really can't go anywhere to help facilitate the f5 break. And it seems like black is kind of going to be angling for c takes d5 in a lot of structures, I thought, because that's the real only way to try and free black's position is to go c takes d5 and put a rook on c8, probably rook a c8 or rook e c8, and try to play along the c file and get some counterplay that way, because the f file is kind of cautioned off right now. So based upon this idea, and because I thought that he really, really was lacking counterplay, I actually made a somewhat controversial decision to play bishop takes c5. And if you've been following this channel at all, you know that I really, really like my bishop pair. I don't usually give up bishops for knights unless there's a really, really reasonable justification. And here I thought this was one, because after bishop takes c5 and d takes c5, all of a sudden here, now taking on d5 is less desirable, because with these double pawns on the c file, whenever you play cd5, then the b5 and d5 squares are permanently sensitive. And also the d6 square is also a little bit loose. And with my knights now on c3 and this next one coming to c4, I thought this would be a very, very annoying pawn tension that would be kind of something that would hang over black's head for the remainder of the middle game. And that's why after d takes c5, I actually went knight c4. And you can see here, these knights are wonderfully placed on the queen side. The dark squared bishop on g7 isn't really a factor right now because it's blocked by its own pawn on e5. And I thought at some juncture, d6 might be a move, just, ensuring me a passed pawn far up the board. But I thought that there's no need to rush with that because cd5 really does not make a whole lot of sense. I could play ed5, and then even d6 becomes a threat there, and my bishop gets opened up on the long diagonal. In short, I thought white had a massive, massive advantage here. After knight c4, black actually went rook e d8. Makes some sense. Now that the e file is kind of shut off, there's no potential e takes d4. Getting the rook lined up against the queen, makes reasonable sense. So I went queen e2 to just get my queen out of the way of that rook on d8. And now knight e8 was played, trying to actually provide more attention to the d6 square, which is going to be a very, very sensitive square. Typically with passed pawns, the square in front of the pawn is one you have to pay attention to, because it's one that, the defending side will try to blockade on, and it's honestly the square that the player that has the passed pawn will try to advance it into. So typically you really have to be quite aware about the square in front of the pass pawn. Same thing actually with isolated pawns too. When you have all these IQP positions in the Caro-Kann and the Panov Botvinnik and the Caro-Kann, or sometimes in the Nim that they come from the Nimzo. These IQP positions, you always need to worry about the square in front of the IQP. So anyways, after knight e8, I went rook a d1, just going for mass centralization here, because I am again trying to focus in on this d6 square. And honestly, I was also thinking about playing d6 now, because now that my rook's on d1, my knight's on c4, if the queen is forced back to b8 or c8 and the rooks aren't connected anymore, the queen might be a little bit off sides, and it might enable me to kind of leverage that into an initiative on the king side. So d6 was something I was certainly looking at now with every single move. After rook a d1, bishop f8 was played. And here's actually a critical moment in the game, because if you've noticed the past few moves, black is, concentrating all his forces around defending the d6 square, but he's extremely passive. All of his pieces are on the 8th or 7th rank. He doesn't really have great control of the center. And again, I have this really great positive pawn tension on this side of the board. So very, very difficult for black to do stuff. And it's really incumbent upon me to try and, go forward and press my advantage. When you have space, you want to continue to press onward. And I was trying to figure out what the best way to press onward was, but I missed the mark. The best move in this position is actually one that I'd taken a brief glance at, but had not seriously calculated, and it's actually the move f4. And the idea with f4 is that now that the bishop has vacated the g7 square and in turn protection over e5, e5 is actually extremely sensitive. And if you play e takes f4, it looks like white's just losing a pawn here, but in fact the breakthrough e5 is decisive. And note that now d6 is a serious threat, so you really just are getting rolled over in the middle of the board. And the line continues: f takes g3, e6. This is a key move. F takes e6, d takes e6, and then the bishop has to go back to c8. And then again, now the rooks aren't connected anymore, and tactics tend to appear when that happens. Rook takes d8, queen takes d8, and e7. And yeah, basically in this position, white's just actually winning a piece because the bishop is and the queen are essentially skewered. And yeah, black is up 2 pawns, but the g3 pawn is not really a factor. And once that gets picked off, it's just going to be easy pickings for white because, again, black is actually so passive and white is so well centralized. So this is actually a huge missed opportunity for me, this f4, e5, e6 breakthrough. And it's actually quite typical, again, when you have passed pawns, these types of breakthroughs can happen because you concentrate all your forces around going forward, and your opponent's a little bit passive, and again, tactics just tend to appear when those types of dynamics are on the board. So, but anyways, I actually was angling for f4, but I thought, this doesn't work right away, so I'm actually going to prepare it with queen f1, and this is just too slow. Because now with queen f1, it gives black the opportunity to actually play f6 and reinforce that e5 pawn, which was not as attractive and an option a move ago. So this actually gives black a much needed time to kind of consolidate just a little bit. And it's a little bit frustrating because f4 does not have the same power it did a move ago. Now, white is still better. Again, this is still a nice tension on d5, and white can still actually be very patient here. Doubling rooks might be an option. Playing knight e3 and just sitting on the position is an option. Actually, playing d takes d6 and then knight e3 is also quite intriguing, but just to try and put a knight on d5. All these things are quite decent. Instead, I decided to press onward now with f4. I thought, the whole idea with queen f1 was to play f4, so why not get on with it? Another interesting idea was actually to play h4, with the idea that you actually try to trade off the light squared bishops with bishop h3, because once those bishops come off the board, the coverage of black's coverage of the light squares, particularly e6, c6, d5, and f7, becomes a little bit less than ideal. So White would still have an edge in those types of positions as well. But I just thought, you know what? Let me press onward, and, I have the space. I have centralized pieces. I should be better here, right? Well, the thing is I am, but it's not so clear. And part of the reason that's the case is because Black does have the 2 bishops, which are long-term trumps. So now that I'm actually going forward, it's pretty incumbent upon me to actually make sure it works, because if it doesn't work, it can actually go quite poorly. And unfortunately, that's kind of what winds up transpiring, because after f4, knight d6 was played, and White still is a reasonable position here, but I think I was a little bit too overzealous in trying to push the initiative forward. And I played the move d takes d6, which was extremely unnecessary. There was no reason to resolve the tension, activate the bishop on d7, help him centralize a little bit. I could have kept the same position I had with a move like knight e3 and been more patient. There were just a lot of other things. I could have even taken on d6 if I wanted and just sat on the position. But what I did was rush. And, again, when you have the space advantage, you have positive pawn tension, you should only release the tension when you have an overwhelming way to kind of, essentially take advantage of it. So unless you're kind of going to get immediate dividends with the exchange or material, you really shouldn't release tension, because it gives your opponent an opportunity to kind of free up his game, activate his pieces, and so on. So after d takes c6, bishop takes c6, all of a sudden this bishop on c6 is way better than it was on d7, and even the rook on d8 has a chance now to play on the d file. The reason I played d takes c6 was a mistaken calculation, because now I actually played f takes e5. And this was basically my concept, was I thought, I'm just winning a pawn here. If f takes e5, knight takes e5, I have nothing to be concerned about, because I'm hitting the bishop on c6. After I take that, I'll be able to play e5 and dislodge the knight on d6, and all will be well. A pawn up with centralized pieces, a safer king. White should be winning, right? Well, not so fast. Instead, I should have played the move, instead of f takes e5, I should have played knight e3, and again angled for the d5 square, just putting a knight on d5, from where it also attacks the queen on c7 and also targets the pawn on f6. But after f takes e5, my opponent very, very quickly played the move knight takes c4. And it's actually a completely obvious move if you spend any time seriously calculating the position. But I just saw, I'm winning a pawn. This must work for me. And I took a major step in the wrong direction. Now, the problem here is that after queen takes c4 check, which I'm kind of obliged to play, Black actually just has the move king h8. And even though I'm a pawn up here, I have a massive issue on the dark squares. Again, I gave up my dark squared bishop to spoil Black's queenside structure earlier. Now it's actually not so bad, because Black's rooks are connected and, at least challenging on the d file. And all of a sudden, my dark squares on the king side are extremely weak. So the g3 pawn is hanging. E5 is, of course, hanging. And if I go e takes f6, queen takes g3 is actually a very, very serious move, with the idea of even maybe following up with bishop d6. So all of a sudden here, Black is the one that has real counterplay on the dark squares, and I have to be extremely cautious. And I must say I was a little bit shaken by the developments, because I thought I had a risk-free position where I could just press forever, and all of a sudden here I'm strategically worse, because this bishop on g2 is extremely, extremely passive. And as long as the pawn is on e4, it's kind of like a fat pawn locked behind the structure. In fact, it actually reminded me of a game that I played in the Grandmaster Chess Open earlier this year that I showed in the Road to Grandmaster series, where I had a similar fianchetto bishop on g2, actually in a fianchetto King's Indian, where I was better. I went forward. I failed in going forward properly, and then Black started to take over later on in the game. And that's kind of the risk that you kind of are, the fire that you're kind of playing with when you actually go forward and don't have the strategic trumps that you once had. So, yeah, that's actually another reason why I tend to prefer playing a slower game, because it gives you a larger margin for error, so to speak. So anyways, after king h8, I went e takes f6. I picked up the gauntlet and took a second pawn. But now queen takes g3 is played, and it's quite clear that, black's not losing anymore. Black has a very, very active queen on the dark squares here. Bishop d6 is an idea. My bishop on g2 is quite poor. I can't reinforce the f6 pawn with e5 because this mate on g2. And I don't love it. I went knight d5, trying to limit the scope of this bishop on the long diagonal and also reinforce the idea of e5 again. But now Christian played bishop d6, and you could see here that he's starting to take control in the dark squares, and I have some problems. Bishop e5 is an idea. Queen h2 check is a problem. And this is not a fun position to face, especially when you don't have a lot of time. I went rook e2, trying to just defend the second rank a little bit more, and in some lines shift my rook over to f2 because I thought that queen h2 check was just one check and didn't really do so much, so I wasn't super worried about it. Black wound up playing queen h2 check anyway, and now I went king f1, and my concept here was that if I play rook f2, I'm kind of secure or shielding myself from the checks, and I still do have this nice pawn on f6, so I thought that if I was able to kind of weather the storm in the next few moves, maybe trade the queens and keep my pawns, I thought I'd be able to hold quite decently. Black now went queen e5, though, and this is actually a very, very strong move because what it does is it actually holds my e4 pawn in place, stops me from reinforcing the f6 pawn with e5 in certain positions, and it also introduces ideas of bishop takes d5 and queen takes f6. And even with the presence of opposite-colored bishops, the position will be quite difficult for me to play because the quality of the remaining bishop would be in black's favor. So essentially positions where there's like bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, or queen takes d5, and queen takes f6 check still seem quite unpleasant for me because black can put his bishop on e5 and kind of just block out my bishop on g2. So anyways, after queen e5, I went rook f2 just to try and hold on to that f6 pawn. And now black actually went rook b8. And all of a sudden I have new problems because b5 is also a serious threat in this position because after a takes b5, bishop takes b5, there's this skewer on my king and queen. So I thought I was actually being clever with rook f2 because I thought if queen takes b2, he might be losing some coverage in the middle. I might be able to play c3 and block out the queen. But rook b8 is actually quite a serious move. I now went knight b6, trying to just stop this b5 idea. A better move would have actually been knight f4. And the point is that in some lines I actually can jump in with queen f7 and threaten queen g7 mate. And also sometimes there's knight takes g6 as an option as well. So those were two resources that deserves serious consideration. But instead I went knight b6. And now queen takes b2 is played, and you could just see here that not only am I down the two bishops, my pawn structure's mangled. I have several pawn islands, and endgames here are going to be extremely unfavorable for me given the dynamic. My king is weak. Black has the two bishops. Black has a better pawn structure. All those things start to matter, and so black has the long-term trumps. After queen takes b2, I went queen f7, just trying to threaten mate, but I knew this could be easily parried with bishop f8, and it was. And after bishop f8, I went rook fd2, and this was kind of like a last-ditch effort to try and get something, get some type of cheap tactic, because I recognize now that if I put my knight back on d5, he really can consider just taking the knight on d5, but he probably can also make some other moves because I really don't have any attack or checkmate on g7, so I'm just a little bit too passive. So I thought that knight d5 was going to be the slow death, and I figured that if I'm significantly worse, probably losing, I might as well go for something that might give me some chances rather than something where I'm just defending a hopeless position, and that's why I played rook fd2, although obviously it's not practically or objectively an effective move. Rook takes d2 is played, and then I took on d2, and now queen takes b6 was played, and I'm just simply down a piece here. I have no compensation, no real serious initiative, but I did try my last few chances because we weren't at move 40 yet, and I thought maybe there'd be some chance of confusing him. So I now went for the move e5. And so I was pinning my hopes now on having these two connected pass pawns on this, potentially coming to the 6th rank and getting some initiative in that type of position. Queen b4 is played, though. Very, very good move. Challenging my rook on d2 and also shifting the queen towards the king side, from which I'm going to have to worry about a lot of different checks. I went bishop d5, at least trying to trade these bishops on my terms, because I didn't really want to play bishop takes c6, because after b takes c6, the rook on b8 gets active. So I like bishop d5 from the standpoint that it at least threatens mate and forces black to trade on d5. So queen f4 check was played first. I went rook f2, and now queen c1 check, king g2. I think, black was kind of trying to rush because he was he didn't need to make the time control and was also in serious time trouble. And after queen g5 check, king f1, I actually thought we might actually repeat here because he'd now repeated twice. But now he took on d5 and resolved that question. And after queen takes d5, rook e8 was played. And unbelievably here, I could not believe this when I looked at the game afterwards with the computer. White is actually winning in this position, a piece down. And I just had a one-move tactic here that you might actually be able to see now that I've actually kind of telegraphed it. But I could not believe that I missed this over the board, because this is really my one chance to turn this game around. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out white to play and win here. How can white all of a sudden win this game a piece down? All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what the one-move tactic is. Amazingly, the move queen g8 check is forcing and wins on the spot. The point is actually that after king takes g8, f7, I'm actually just securing the rook and the exchange and getting a queen and still attacking even. And all of a sudden, it's just completely lost because the rook and the queen are hitting the bishop on f8. This king on g7 is extremely weak, and white does not have a perpetual. Queen c1 check, king g2, queen g5 check, and king h2, and then there are just no more checks. So miraculously, white was actually winning for a move with queen g8, but unfortunately, I just didn't see it. And it was right before move 40 that I had this opportunity. And this was basically my last gasp opportunity to try and turn things around, and I just didn't. I played more passively with rook e2, but now after queen f5 check, king g2, and queen e6, white firmly blockades the pawns, and any dreams of doing anything with this game are just over. I went queen takes c6. An argument could have been made for playing c4 and trying to hold the fort in this way, but I did think that black would probably consolidate with king g8, king f7, but c4 was a better try, and I probably should have thought a little bit harder about it. Instead, I took on e6, trying to consider running my king up to d5, but that wasn't very effective. After rook takes e6, king f3, king g8, king e4, king f7, I went c4 here, but this is actually not super effective because now bishop d6 came, and this was just kind of moronic on my part to allow the bishop to actually shift to a better diagonal where it can actually play. Instead, king d5 right away would have been a little bit more effective, but this position is still lost. Black could probably play g5 and h5 and start to distract me on the queen side, or even jettison the c-pawn with c4 and activate his bishop along this diagonal. But king d5 certainly would have been a better try. The other thing here, though, is that rook e8 becomes a move, and the point is that e6 check just fails to king takes f6. Then he can just blockade the remaining pawn. And the threat with rook e8 is actually to go rook d8 check. And then once the king is forced to move back, then the black king moves to e6 and all is well. So for instance, if I play h4, rook d8 check, king c4, and king e6, and these pawns just aren't going anywhere. So basically, I was trying to play c4 just because I realized that rook e8 was a move. But after c4, bishop d6, and now even pawn endgames are winning for black. because if he gives up his rook and his bishop for these connected passed pawns, he actually has the outside pawns as leverage to take the center of the board, and actually what winds up happening. So after king d5, bishop c7, I really can't do anything but wait. And after rook e1, b6, rook e4, g5, rook e1, and h5, he actually starts to begin securing that outside leverage. Now, there are many, many different ways you can win here, but this kind of just perfectly illustrates that I have absolutely no counterplay, and I'm just helpless, shuffling my rooks back and forth on the e-file. And after rook e2, black finally took on e5, giving up the bishop, but saying, hey, look, the pawn ending's winning. You have absolutely no chances. Just resign. And I took on e5. After bishop takes e5, king takes e5, and then g4. I took on g4, hg4, and then here I decided to throw in the towel, knowing full well that this endgame was just going to be lost in a few moves anyway. After king f4, king takes f6, and king takes g4, the king just comes to the queen's side and collects the remaining pawns. What can I say? Very, very bad start to the tournament. I was very, very shaky in the middle game. I secured a nice opening advantage and, very, very, very nice risk-free position. But, there was some inherent danger just because I had given up the two bishops. So I did kind of give up a little bit of my long-term trumps for a short-term initiative. And I had to cash in the middle game. And because I didn't cash in, it meant that black was able to play and have a significant advantage later on. And so that's in part why the two bishops, matter a lot, because of that, long-term, short-term dynamic. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.